Hi, I'm Jessie, a scientist turned content creator who's had some of the most honest, helpful, and heartwarming chats with fellow researchers. I keep thinking, I wish I recorded that. Someone else needs to hear this. So I started The Unseen Scientist, a podcast about the behind-the-scenes lives of researchers beyond the publications and into the real stuff. Because what we share off the record, that's often what we all need to hear. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Unseen Scientist podcast. We have a very exciting topic today, which is leadership. And we also have a very exciting guest to go along with the episode, Dr. Michelle Shields. I met up with Michelle just about 2 weeks ago. It's such a fantastic time talking about this subject. So I wanted to bring her on to the pod to discuss about it and share all of her extensive knowledge on this topic as well. For a bit of background, Michelle completed her PhD at the North Carolina State University in organizational psychology. She is currently the founder and principal consultant at Fulcrum Associates, a consulting firm focused on integrated talent management strategies. She has over 20 years of experience working with many top companies such as Emirates in New Zealand, and currently she's teaching at the University of Canterbury about professional development in leadership. And on top of all of this, she's also worked at the Canterbury District Health Board and Ag Research, and therefore has extensive experience in developing leadership skills within scientists too.
Yeah.
So, of course, this is why she's a perfect guest to talk on this subject. And with that, welcome, Michelle. How are you?
Kia ora, Jessie. Thank you for having me. And I should say that in that bio, you'll notice that it says 20 plus. So
Yes, over.
That's deliberate because I'm in my third life now. And so we leave the plus for those to guess. But yeah, I'm definitely in my third life now. And, I think it was one of our famous actresses who said that, when women get it to be about 55, they come to a reckoning where they realize, I've got another 30 years to go, which is the equivalent of a whole lifestyle, a whole life.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's me. I'm in my third life. And it gives you a sense of freedom and liberation when you get into your third life. I think you're more open to trying things. So I'm trying something new with you today. So thank you for having me.
Oh, such a pleasure. And thank you for all that and coming on to the podcast. So I wanted to talk about leadership, right? And I wanted to define it because so many of us don't actually know what it is because
Yes.
it's such a broad term.
Yes.
And I went on the Cambridge Dictionary and I typed up leadership. And you know what it said? It said, you probably know this already, but it says a set of characteristics that make a good leader. And while that makes a lot of sense, it also doesn't make sense.
It's kind of circular, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's
it
quite a
is.
circular argument. Yes.
So I wanted to ask you as the leadership expert
Yeah.
what your definition of leadership
Yeah.
is.
Oh, it's an interesting one because I kind of perked up when you said a set of characteristics because there are sort of two schools of thought around leadership. And one is that it's very trait-based and you either are born with certain qualities and personality characteristics or you're not. And the other is skill-based. And I have to admit that I'm in the skill-based territory. I think we're all leaders, and depending on the context that we're in, some of us exhibit specific skills that are needed in that context. And, if you look at people like Goleman, he does a lot of work with leaders in the area of emotional intelligence. And he would say, and this is kind of the definition that I lean into, is that the leader is anyone who sees what the group needs and acts on that. So essentially, we tend to think of leaders as the top of the organization or someone in a position of influence, but it's actually anyone in a group who sees what the group needs and steps forward to help that group achieve what it needs.
So the flexibility aspect is really important in leadership.
Yes, absolutely. It's very context dependent, and the qualities and the behaviors that will make you successful in one environment might not be the same that you'll need in another one.
So then how can supervisors say, I'm talking about an academic setting where you might have a mentor-mentee relationship, they have a set personality. And that could
Yes.
be like an extroverted personality or an introverted personality. And we think of leaders as being extroverted largely. And I think
Yes.
there's so many introverted people out there who are
Yes.
scientists, especially. There's
Yes.
some correlation there for some reason.
Well,
Mhm.
it's one of the myths of leadership, actually, Jesse, and we still hang on to it. There's a bias towards perceiving that leaders are extroverted or expressive and outgoing,
Yes.
but the reality is that just as many are introverted and reflective.
Hmm.
And just because you're an introvert doesn't mean that you're not influential.
Mm-hmm.
And in one-to-one and in one-to-few situations, a leader can be just as highly effective as an extroverted, expressive person. And coming back to what does the context need? Well, if you're in a group and that group is a group of scientists who are all very knowledgeable in their fields, very, very subject matter expertise, and you take an extroverted person, and if they want to lead the discussion, that group of healed, knowledgeable people will push back. It's like, wait a minute, well, you should be speaking last, not first, because we are actually the voice of understanding here. So in some situations, an extroverted leader is at a disadvantage, whereas a more reflective introverted leader will simply listen to what the members have to say and perhaps add their contributions to a discussion last. So it
Mm-hmm.
really it depends on the maturity and how much depth of expertise there is in the group as to which style of leadership will be most effective in a science group.
That's a really great point. So introverts can be great leaders in their own way, and
Absolutely.
you need to double down on that if possible. But then how can we have extroverted leaders gaining a little bit more of that reflective personality to
Ah,
match
yeah.
their
And
student?
yeah, and that comes back for both sides of it really to self-awareness, because if you're looking to develop yourself as a leader, and we all
Mm,
should be, the first thing you need to do is to be aware of yourself. So what am I good at? What do I need to work on? How do I come across to people? Do people understand me when I make a point, or do they look at me in a puzzled way? So that's where some of the emotional intelligence comes in, is being self-aware and having a level of empathy that allows you to pick up on cues from people in the group as to what that group needs, and then to be able to respond in a way that is appropriate for that situation. Now, I've kind of given you sort of a whole lifetime of work there. That's something that we develop over time, but as a starting point, it's around self-awareness. So an
mhm,
extroverted leader needs to be aware that they can take over sometimes, and that that's something that could be a limiting factor in their effectiveness. And so, you can do that by one, giving yourself cues to make sure that you speak last, or only offer a few contributions, or ask other people to expound on their ideas. Or you can, get a buddy, get someone next to you and say, hey, look, I'm working on, trying not to take over in this discussion. Can you kind of give me a nudge at the side of the table if it looks like I'm doing that?
mm. So I've heard of some lab groups who do personality tests at the start of the
Oh,
year or something like the Myers-Briggs or like
yeah,
Enneagrams, and then I don't know how they would work after. I guess they'll reflect on it and
yeah,
then try to adjust their relationship based on those
yes.
personality tests. Do you think it's important for every lab group to do those tests?
Well, I think anything that raises your self-awareness about
Mm,
how you're coming across is really beneficial. So one of the things I encourage people to do is that if you're going to do a personality test, if you're not already highly self-aware, that is, you don't already know yourself really well, your strengths, your weaknesses, etc., it's really good to get another point of view.
mhm,
So there are some tools that we use in this space, such as the Belbin team roles, that allow us to see ourselves as others see us. And that opens up a whole window of opportunity. I was using this with a science group that works in engineering for fire, and they were surprised in their Belbin feedback at how different people see them in the team than they see themselves.
Hmm.
So I do think it's highly valuable, particularly because so much science work is done in a collaborative way. You might have one specific part that you're responsible for, but ultimately you might be contributing to something much bigger than yourself. So to know, what kind of strengths you bring to the team challenge, I think is highly valuable. And if you don't mind me just expounding on this. So I was working with a group of climate scientists, and they write policy and for New Zealand around climate. And when we did the Belbin, we discovered that the majority of the group were what we call thinkers. So they are really good at idea generation, concept formation, innovative ideas. But in this group, we had 0 implementers. Now, these are action people who can take ideas like policy and carry those forward into action. So that was quite an insight for them to understand as a group where their strengths are, because you don't have to be good at everything, but leadership is generally the presence of a few key strengths, such that if you can't do everything, people will forgive you those lesser qualities. For example, I used to sit next to uh, a chief clinical biologist, and he was amazing at talking about pathology and the next generation of pathological testing. And if you just got him started, he would paint this picture of the importance of pathology in health treatment that you just leaned forward in your seat and were like, I am so with you on this. I want to be part of this. So very inspiring. But I'll tell you what, you walk into his office and there were stacks of journal articles and books and papers everywhere. Every surface was covered. And so you'd think to yourself, this guy just couldn't manage himself out of a paper bag. But the reality was, because he was so brilliant at some things, that you would forgive him all his messiness. So my point being that if you've got a few key strengths as a leader, that's far more important than being good at everything. And for you to maximize those strengths to what we call profound strengths. So compared to your peers, you're in the top 90th percentile in certain areas. And this particular clinical leader was within the top 10% when it came to his understanding of the future of pathology.
Wow. I mean, that's a really interesting concept and perspective, because we always grow up thinking that we need to be well-rounded people. We're always talking
Yes.
about well-roundedness. You have to develop on your weaknesses and make them better so that you're
Yes.
whole. But then, no, actually doubling down on your strength is actually quite important, is what you're saying.
Yes, and our research in the organization that I work with which is the Zenger-Folkman Group out of North America. We
Hmm.
looked at 125,000 leaders, and we looked at the top 10%, and we looked at the lowest 10%. And we said, what are those defining factors that separate that top 10%? And then what is their impact on overall leadership effectiveness as assessed by their followers?
Mm.
So in a multi-rater feedback tool where your employees, your peers, your manager all give feedback, what is and using that as, if I can use the term, the dependent variable, what has the greatest impact on that effectiveness? Well, what we discovered was that if you were in the sort of 75th to 90th percentile in 3 areas, 3 of 19 that we assessed, that you would be considered a highly effective leader. And of
Wow.
course, so it's not that you have to be great at 19 things. You need to
Hmm.
be extraordinary at 3 to 5 things.
Wow. Okay. So those 19 things, say, or
Yeah.
15 to 19 things, what kind of categories are there for leadership skills?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that. And, and if I can just sort of introduce this idea of inspirational leadership, because when
Hmm.
we talk about supervision and supervision of scientists, one of the things we all want, whether you work in the corporate setting or you work in an academic setting, is we want to be inspired and we
Mm.
want to be motivated. And so,
Yeah.
you think about those people who you lean forward and you go, I want to be part of this. Well, the things that we know from the research around this is that there are some common elements that make inspirational leaders. And again, we looked at this from the top 10%, comparing them to the lowest 10%. And the 3 things that were common in all 3 were that there were people who would take initiative. So if they could see something that needed to be done, they didn't wait to be asked. So again, if you're thinking that leadership is something that happens once you get to a certain level, I'd say no. This is something that every individual can do, is take initiative. The second thing that they did is role model. So they wouldn't ask you to do something that they themselves wouldn't do. And in
Hmm.
some settings, we call this leading from the front, so or walking the talk. So they tended to role model the behaviors that they wanted from their teams. And the third one, which was common to all the inspirational leaders, is that they were champions of change. Now, that doesn't mean that they were driven to restructure or that sort of thing. It just meant they were always thinking about the future and how could we do things better. And so there was a continuous improvement orientation to them. Now, I should add that there was one more common element that all of these inspirational leaders had. And I suppose you could say that it is a little bit of a trait, unlike some of the others like initiative, role modeling, or championing change. And that was using emotion.
Mm.
So when you connect with someone and you share with them who you are, what you care about, what you're about, what you're passionate about, when you use that kind of emotion, it connects with people, and that's what inspirational leaders do. They have a level of energy such that if they're in a room with you, you feel like you're the most important person in that situation, and they have a way
Hmm.
of doing that even when they're speaking to large groups, that they convey this level of emotion. And so those were four things that I would say. And I often say to leaders, look, if you're looking for something to work on one of these, because we know that they contribute to inspirational leadership. And the interesting thing about inspirational leadership is that it's the last and least developed of the leadership behaviors. So of those
Oh.
19 that I mentioned to you, inspirational leadership is often the very last one when people are being assessed for their effectiveness. But it's number one in terms of what followers would like in a leader. So it's
Oh.
extremely important if you're looking to, particularly if you're someone who's driven to create change and influence ideas. It's very important that you be able to convey a level of inspiration such that people want to go with you on a journey.
Wow, that is just it's such an opposite thing, right? It's the people want inspirational leadership, but it's the sort of least
It's the
developed. And
least developed, which is why I often say to people, pick one of these. You can't
yeah.
go wrong. You cannot go wrong. Yeah.
But then how does one develop that inspirational leadership
Mm,
style and skill in a sort
mm.
of practical way? Do you have any tips or tricks?
Yeah,
Or,
well,
mhm,
let's just talk about role modeling, for
mhm,
example. So, just think about some advice you gave a friend this week, or some advice that maybe someone has given you. And then you say to yourself, so somebody's telling you you should eat right and exercise. And the next thing you know, you see them, in the Dairy Queen or someplace, and they're having a flurry and they're, with extra chocolate. And you think to yourself, well, that's not really what they're telling me to do. And so they're not role modeling. So think about the behaviors that you espouse for others. Maybe it's your kids,
mhm.
are those the same behaviors that you yourself would stand by? And I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, you might know better than I do, but I think it was a story of Gandhi. And the mother took her son to Gandhi and said, "Will you tell him to stop eating sugar?" And Gandhi said, "I'd like you to go away and come back next week." So she did, and when she came back, Gandhi, said, "You must stop eating sugar." And the mother said, "Well, what's different this week from last week?" And he said, "Well, I needed to actually do that myself to see how that felt before I could suggest to you that you should stop eating sugar. So I did." And so, role modeling is about feeling what it feels like to do what you're suggesting someone else does. And so
Mhm.
that's a very simple thing that you can ask yourself, what kind of advice do I give? And do I do that myself?
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. And I think that influence carries over to the students or whoever you're working with. It's just so
Absolutely.
important. Wow. And I also wanted to talk about what about the student side or people who are not in leadership positions?
Right.
How can they develop their leadership qualities from a sort of early career perspective.
Yep. And again, so one of those core of the four around inspirational leadership that I mentioned to you was taking initiative.
Mm.
Well, you can be 8 years old and start a lemonade stand.
Right, right.
You can be 10 and corral your friends to start a club.
Yeah.
Yeah, so initiative is about seeing something that you believe is important to happen and say,
Hmm.
well, I'm not going to wait for someone else to do this. I'm going to do this myself. And not everything works, but initiative is something that will serve you well, whether you're in a position of, seniority or whether you're just a 9-year-old kid who wants to make some pocket money. It's something that we all can do. And that's what we need more of in our communities, to be
Hmm.
honest, is people who say, I'm not happy with the status quo. I'm going to do something about it. And I meet people every day who do that, and I'm inspired every time I do. Like
Absolutely.
yourself, Jessie. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That's really kind of you. But I mean, initiative is a really hard one because sometimes you want to make that change, but the people around you
Yes.
don't really believe in it, or they don't want the change because people like being comfortable. I mean, people are
Yeah,
like,
they
I
sure
don't want
do.
change and I don't want to do this. So why are you the sore
Yeah.
thumb coming
Yeah.
out and changing everything? And they try to push you down. So how does
Yeah.
one develop that initiative skill when it feels like the environment is against
Yeah.
you sometimes?
Well, and so there's two parts to that story. One is the environment. We'll talk about that in a second. But the first is, and I guess it's a skill, but it's also something that you develop through practice, and that's courage.
Mm.
So having courage to say, I don't care if no one else wants to wear this particular kind of outfit. I'm going to wear it anyway because I
Yeah.
like it,
Mm.
and if they don't like it, that's okay. So but then let's think about the context. And in the context, something I would encourage your listeners to have a look at is there's a YouTube video called the Shirtless Dancer, or I think it's also
Mm.
called oh gosh, there's another name for it. But the point being is it shows a group of people who are at a rock concert, an outdoor rock concert, and this one guy gets up and he takes initiative and he starts dancing. And he's not, let's just say he's not the greatest dancer. He's a bit erratic, but he's so into it that another guy who's sitting there with him gets up and starts dancing too. And
Mm.
so pretty soon you get the whole side of the hill of people who are up and dancing, except for this group on the hill. There's this one small group and they're just looking like, you guys are idiots.
Mhm.
So what happens is you reach a tipping point. So if you think about the environment around you, you might be one person doing that at first. What you need is one follower. And
Mm.
so it's really, leadership is about followership as much as anything. And you need an important follower who will follow you and exhibit that behavior as well, because that gives other people permission who maybe were a little bit reluctant at first to get on board. And eventually what happens is the people who are sitting there not dancing that become the odd ones out.
Right,
And that
right.
happens in organizations all the time with change. You reach a tipping point where there's more people who are advocates for the idea than there are individuals who aren't. And the organization has a way of managing those people. Sometimes it goes underground, but more often than not, they find that their values no longer align with where the organization is going, and they may
Mhm.
opt to go elsewhere.
That's a really good point. I think there's a book about the tipping point. I
Yeah,
think,
there is.
yeah.
Hmm.
Think I watched a YouTube video about it.
Yes, it's by Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh
Yes, there is a
yes,
book. Yes.
that's right. And it's so fascinating that you can be the odd ones out and then
Hmm.
not, depending on the percentage of the people that believe in one thing versus another.
That's
Um,
right.
so,
And the advocacy doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in a
mm-hmm.
context. So, advocates can be successful. As a leader, you can be successful in taking initiative if people can see that it would work for them as well. So a good advocate is someone who you trust,
Mm-hmm.
who says to you, look, I tried this and this was a great idea. It worked really well for me. And you think to yourself, well, maybe, maybe not. So you start to try it on. Well, if you start to see real benefits for other people and you
Mm-hmm.
start to see support for it in the organization around you or the community that you're in, you might be more open to giving it a try. So you go from being sort of a gestating incubating kind of idea to actually jumping on board. Now, the things that will help that, number one, is leadership. So if you have
Mm-hmm.
leadership that advocates for that idea, that's number one. But also having reinforcing systems that make it worthwhile. In some changes we initiate, we're trying to get people to make a change in behavior, but they're thinking to themselves, this is just too hard. This is too much work. I don't have time. So you've got to make it rewarding for the person to do that.
Mm-hmm. And so then how can institutions themselves, so like a university, instill a lot of those leadership skills in students and also leaders, like supervisors, for example?
Yeah. Well, and really, and here in New Zealand, I think we've actually done quite a good job of this in some of our school systems. And to be honest, we saw a big emphasis in it after the earthquakes here in Christchurch because people were going through so much. We had
Mm,
to teach empathy skills, and we had to teach coping skills, and we had to teach resilience skills. Those skills are skills that you need your whole life. So we shouldn't wait till someone gets to university to teach them
mm,
compassion, to
mm-hmm.
teach them empathy, to teach them to ask good questions, to understand someone's point of view. And so I think it starts actually far before university. But if it doesn't, and it hasn't, I do think that our basic courses. So one of the courses I do at the university is a leadership course. And I was asking them, because I was brought in recently to join the team there and teaching it. I said, have we taught them how to effectively debate ideas?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is a critical skill, and particularly in science, because you're experimenting, you're trying new things. You need to know how to separate personal criticism from criticism about the idea that could make it better if you listened. So, teaching people how to have an effective debate without it turning into a personal attack is a
Right.
critical skill that we need to be teaching in the classroom.
Absolutely. It's so important for scientists themselves as well, academics generally, because we get criticized about whatever experiments we do or whatever results we have all the time. And we,
Exactly, exactly. And if you feel like, and it does get down to a question of trust sometimes, if you feel like this person is saying this because they have the same goal in mind that I do, they
mm,
want this idea to succeed.
hmm
And if I look at this feedback and I make this improvement to the way I'm doing this approach, it's going to go forward. So
right.
it's about teaching what Amy Edmondson's calls intelligent failure. And she talks about this idea of teaming and how you need to be creating an environment. The leader's job is to create an environment of psychological safety such that it's okay to say, well, actually, I disagree with you about that. And can
hmm
we talk about that more? Or actually, I did that step and it didn't work. And without fear of repercussion. So
Right.
it's an environment of safety that allows you to get things wrong.
That's a really great point. And I have this relationship with my old supervisor that I also say things um, with safety. I always felt safe when I spoke my mind about things. I may disagree with my supervisor or not,
Yes.
or agree with him, and he'd be totally, completely fine with that. And I really
Yes.
appreciated that. But I understand not everyone has that opportunity and that environment to speak their minds. And especially when it comes to, I guess, backgrounds of culture when
Yes.
culture kind of comes into um, academic culture as well together, and it doesn't work very well when you speak your mind as a sort of lower person in a hierarchical
Yes,
situation.
you've really identified a really critical thing. I did some work in the Middle East several
Mm,
years ago, and I remember I was working with a group of baggage handlers, and we were talking about setting targets for their teams
hmm
for recovery of lost bags. And as we were having this discussion, I was asking the group of leaders, you know, um, do you set targets with your team? And I just had this realization that for some, the whole idea of participative management might be quite foreign, that they would ask their team what they thought,
Right.
and so there are cultural differences, and there's a whole group of work or a whole piece of work from a person called Hofstede, and they talk about this idea of power distance. And
Mm,
power distance is the comfort that you have speaking back to someone who you would normally consider in a position of authority. And so in some cultures, it's not appropriate to dissent.
Right.
in a person who you would consider to have a person of authority. And I remember teaching my first leadership class about, oh gosh, probably 15 years ago. No, more than that now that I think about it, probably 18 years ago. And asking the group of students, 45% of whom were international students in the classroom, what is leadership? And one brave student raised his hand and he said, leadership is doing what my parents tell me to do. So as you get into the university, some people have still, are still following exactly what the rule book says to do. And
Mm,
what we create is a sense of learned helplessness. I won't do anything unless someone tells me
right.
exactly what I should do. So it occurred to me the other day that, when they get out into the work environment and we're expecting that people to take initiative and to work under their own steam, if they haven't developed that sense of autonomy,
Hmm.
they're going to be at a loss, because no one is going to tell them every step to do. They might in the beginning, but it won't last long. And so you've got to develop that skill.
Especially at postgrad level, where you're supposed to take initiative and take action on your own accord and not relying on your supervisor forever
Exactly. You should
and
be
be
at a point
independent.
there where you've got a position of excellence, you've got
Right.
connection to your own purpose of why you want to do this, and you're feeling this sense of autonomy and what they call self-efficacy. I can do this, and I have
Mm,
something significant to contribute. Because really, scientific endeavor and postgraduate work is about innovation. So what are you
right.
bringing that's new and different?
Right.
And so, if you're a leader in that space around innovation, it's very important that you foster that sense of independence and self-determinism in the people in your teams. And so again, that kind of comes back to some of the things we were talking about that the introverted leader does quite well, which is not take front and center and allow and empower people to own the work.
Hmm. Hmm. And I wanted to go back to emotional intelligence because
Hmm.
obviously a lot of people in grad school or having gone through grad school, they are intelligent and it's not emotional intelligence. There's something different about that. So what is emotional intelligence
Yeah.
and what can we do to support academics who
Yeah.
want to learn more about it and improve on it?
Yeah. Yeah, well, first of all, just a little bit of history because emotional intelligence is just one form of intelligence. And there's a gentleman by the name of Howard Gardner who comes out of education. And Howard Gardner was the first to assert that there were at least 16 different types of intelligence. So,
Wow.
and quite often when we take students into programs of study, we assess their verbal ability, we assess their quantitative ability, we might assess their logic ability, their spatial ability. But Gardner said that there are at least 16 types of intelligence. And you can imagine this. There are some people who are extremely good at aesthetic ability. They're artists. And
Mm-hmm.
then there are people who have a musical ability,
Mm,
and the other one that he talked about was, and he called it social ability. And this is basically that ability to read cues. So think about the person who's the best salesperson you've ever met. Well, what makes them a good salesperson? Well, that ability to read someone's body language, to
mm,
hear what they're saying, and then to adapt their style to what the person seems to be looking for. So some of our very best salespeople are good because they have a very acute social ability in social intelligence. Now, if we take it over to emotional intelligence, it's those things plus. So it starts, as I said, with self-awareness and knowing yourself. That's step one. The second thing is empathy. So being able to perceive things as others might perceive them. Step three is being able to kind of self-regulate. So instead of, just saying everything that comes into your mind, reflecting and thinking, is this going to help this relationship? Maybe I shouldn't say that. And then, of course, and it's one of the holy grails of emotional intelligence is that leadership ability to read the room and adapt your leadership communication style to what's called for in that situation. And that's where our salespeople just have it, in aces, is they're
mm-hmm,
able to
mm-hmm.
read a situation and adapt their style to that situation.
Wow. And if a supervisor is new to the whole supervisory experience and
Mm,
they want to bring all of these in, but they don't know where to start, where's the
right.
first point of like where do we go from there?
Yeah.
Who would
Well,
we call?
if I were a brand new supervisor, I'd probably approach, and if I were coaching them, say as a new
Hmm.
supervisor, I would coach them exactly the same way I coach a new frontline leader. And so first
Mm.
of all, it's being able to understand your team or the cohort of students that you're going to be working with. Now, every student comes in with a level of expertise and experience, and they all come in with a level of confidence. And some have high levels of one and not the other. So if you first need to understand, how experienced and competent, knowledgeable are they, and then how confident are they?
Hmm.
Because if they lack confidence, you might need to do a bit more in the area of instilling confidence through teaching and
Right.
training and imparting through mentoring about what it was like when you were a grad student, and to share some of those stories. Now, if they come in and they're highly confident, but they may lack some of those core skills, you might need to do a bit more around helping them raise their self-awareness. Some of the
Hmm.
leaders that I work with at the moment, they suffer, and this is a bit of a sidebar, but they suffer from a condition called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this is where you estimate your skills high above what other people perceive in you. And it
Mm.
can be a real blind spot for some people to think that I'm really good at this when in fact you're actually not, but you don't realize it. So the supervisor needs to understand, where do they fall on this continuum of confidence and competence. And if they're low on both, starting with some basic training and bringing them up to speed. Like, we have a lot of adult students, and I met two of them today in this morning MBA course, and they're returning to study for the first
Hmm.
time in many years. They haven't done any study in years. So they may be low in both, how to critically assess as well as their confidence in terms of what they know. And you're going to need to do a bit of work around bringing them up to speed. But once they do, you might do a bit more mentoring in terms of, well, when I was in your shoes, this is how I tackled this situation. Or, I understand, that you're going to get some pushback about this method or that method. Here's what you might want to consider. But as they grow and they become both competent, so they know their stuff, and they become confident, they've had some few times around the track and they've presented papers and they've been to conferences, you're going to want to switch to more of a coaching mode. And this
Hmm.
really is about asking really good questions and being a really good listener. Now, you can't actually do any of those without actually being a good listener. So I would first be encouraging our supervisor to bone up on what good listening looks like. And it's funny because I was having a coaching session with an executive leader in emergency services yesterday, actually. And he had on his development plan, he wanted to be a better listener. So this isn't something that you just do once and you're done.
Hmm.
It's lifelong personal mastery. But we talked about, I said, well, what does it look like? And he said, well, I would probably be fully present. I would put things to the side that might be distracting. I would be, body language. I would be sitting forward, making eye contact. I'd probably be summarizing some of the key things that they're saying and building on those things. I might ask some things out of curiosity to understand better. So, those are all core skills that anybody can learn. And whether you're supervising someone who's low in confidence and low in experience or high in those things, listening is a critical skill. And then in the coaching space, and this is something I know you and I talked about before, Jesse, is that ability to ask good questions. Now, certainly as a supervisor, you should have, gotten your head around asking the Socratic questions of why. So if someone is talking about their preliminary results, or, to give that, well, why are you getting that? What's behind that? Those are all good questions that a supervisor asks, but I'm talking about those kind of questions that make the student or the graduate go, oh gosh, that's a really good question. I never thought of
Hmm.
that. So good questions are questions that make you go, good question. But they're also questions that maybe raise something about the assumptions that have been made. Good questions might be those that ask the the student to reflect on where they are and how they got to that conclusion. So, good questions are really, really important as you get highly experienced people. So in the workplace, that's the skills that we really focus on for leaders, is being a good coach and being able to ask good questions and listen with intent and be able to bring something new to the conversation that maybe the person hasn't thought of yet.
Mm. Oh, that's amazing. And I just want to ask, how often do you think those conversations need to happen between the mentor and mentee to keep
Well,
up?
it does come back again to those preliminary assessments around competence and confidence. And so, if someone were brand new, I'd say you need to be having those conversations on a more regular basis
Mm-hmm.
because confidence comes through experience and feedback. And so, you've got to have those opportunities to get feedback on a more regular basis until you find your feet, until you build some basis for acting on your own in a more autonomous way. But once you become quite knowledgeable and experienced, and maybe even on par with the person who is your supervisor, you need those less and less. That's not to say that you don't need them because, people want to feel valued. And so
Mm-hmm.
some of those conversations are as much about feeling valued as they are about, inquiry. So, I say to leaders, even if they're your mighty oaks, they're your go-to person, you still should be having one-to-ones because, you might need their help. You might need them to be mentoring someone else. You might need them to be training someone else. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not you don't just give up because they've arrived or they're mature in their area of expertise.
The reason why I was asking is because a lot of the one-to-ones we do have with our supervisors tend to be very just on the science level and less
Yes,
on the deeper level of
yes,
how are you going and how are you
yes,
feeling. It's more
yes,
like, this is my result and we're going to talk about it. And so how do supervisors and also mentees incorporate those discussions in a more fluid way and to
yes.
make them grow as people?
Well, you can build in a checklist, and this is what we
Mm,
do with leaders whose one-to-ones frequently are just a reflection of work in progress, which is what you're
mm,
talking about. That's the typical one-to-one, and so to look at that work in progress as a checklist. Well, that's one item on the checklist. How are you progressing with this? Then you might have a checklist around how are you going with working with the team if you're involved in a team project? How is the team progressing? How are things at home? How is your partner coping with the new child? Whatever that might be. So a checklist around well-being, a checklist around team interaction, including in the checklist your own development. Do you feel like you're learning new things? And you could do that just with sliders, even in advance. So one of the tools that I use, which is a one-to-one checklist, we asked the employee before the one-to-one on a sliding scale of 0 to 10, how are you feeling about these 8 things? And
mm.
the leader then sees that in advance and uses that as a jump-off point as to what they should talk about. But even if you didn't have that, to just have an agenda that includes those items on it as a prompt, after you did it once or twice, people would expect it and they would come prepared to talk about it. And you'd be amazing the things that people would tell you if you asked. And even if you just said simply, how are you really? How are you really? And because a lot of times we say that in a casual way. How are you? Like, bread going across the scanner at the grocery market. But no, really, are you coping well? Are you learning? Are you thriving? Are you having fun? And if you don't ask that, you're not going to know and you're not going to be building the relationship that is deep in trust that you really need for that kind of development to happen.
Absolutely. And I think trust is such a great keyword to put in right here and right now, because if you don't trust your supervisor and vice versa, it's just not going to be a great relationship at all. Um,
Absolutely.
uh,
Absolutely. And we've done some research around trust and we tend to, we've said, well, what is it really? We know
mhm.
that it's like salt. It makes everything taste better if you have it. But if so what does it look like? Well, it's typically when I leave the room, would I trust this person to have my back? Would I
Mm,
trust them to speak well of me to others. That's one aspect. Then there's the second aspect, which is this supervisor consistent in how they work with me? Or are they, one day, totally, irritable and don't want to see me. And then the next day they're all, oh, my prime prized best student in the class kind of thing. So are they consistent? Because consistency and follow through are the second dimension we look at. But then the third one, which, we don't talk about it very much, but do I trust my supervisor's judgment? So if they're
Mm.
saying, this is the best method, this is the best approach, this is the best, whatever, do I trust them? Or is that really outside their area of expertise and they're guessing? Or they've gotten it wrong and someone else got sent back to the drawing board because of it. And we often don't think about that aspect of trust, but it's just as important as the first two around, do I trust them to have my back, and are they consistent?
Wow, wow. And I think maybe getting a second opinion is good at that point,
Yes.
like your friend, a peer.
Yes.
And we have to talk about peer mentorship with you, of course, because
Yes. And
this
so
is.
when you
Mhm.
said to me about, well, what if your supervisor doesn't go into that, well, how are you really space? Well,
Mm-hmm.
you know what? We can support each other in that space. And well-being is one of those topics that often people won't go to their manager or their supervisor about. They don't want to show vulnerability, or
Mm,
they don't trust their leader to handle what they tell them with confidentiality. But what you could do is talk to a peer. And so I'm a big advocate of teaching people some of those basic coaching skills of asking good questions and listening with intention,
mm,
so that, if you are having a really rough time, and you say to them, I didn't get any sleep over the weekend. The baby was up all weekend, and I don't know, my mother-in-law is driving me crazy. They could, instead of going, oh, you think that's bad, listen to this. You might get someone who goes, that sounds really awful. Can you tell me more about it? And then you get to the point where you think, you say to them, that sounds really awful. Is there anything you can do to alleviate that situation? Because coaching is about assuming that people have the ability to solve their own problems if they're
mm.
given enough time and space to think about those solutions. But so often we jump in with advice. Oh, here's what you need to
Right,
do. This is
right,
how I
right.
did it. And so we could teach those skills to each other so that we could be each other's well-being coach if we're not getting that from our supervisor.
That's a great point. And I always look on Reddit about relationships between friends where some people prefer that advice sort of yeah, advice from people,
Yes.
whereas some people need people to just listen to them and
Yes.
vent. And there's sort of a mismatch sometimes, and that's where
Yes.
friendships sort of fall off and there's fights and etc. So how can we manage that in peer-to-peer mentorship?
Yeah. Well, you know what? So let's imagine that you're the peer and someone comes to you and they've explained this horrible weekend that they've had. The first thing you should do, and it's what we call, sort of scene setting, is saying, "What would you like from me today? Do you want just somebody to listen because you just need to vent, or do you want some advice, or do you want me to help coach you through this?" And so, it becomes a more advanced skill for some, but certainly asking, what's the best thing that could help you right now? Because quite
Mm,
often it's just the closing the door and I just have to tell someone this because it's driving me mad. And you don't
mm.
want their advice. I live with, I'm married to an engineer and he's a problem solver and he could solve any problem. And so if I say, oh, I've just had this horrible day at work, he will jump into problem solving mode when all I really want is someone to listen to the day I've had. So that ability to say, what do you need from me right now?
Mm. I think the big thing, the overarching theme of today about leadership is about asking. That's what
Yes.
I've gotten from the 45 minutes we've been talking. You have to ask the right questions and know how to ask them, and also act on that. I think that's the main point, how you combine all of those approaches together and make an effective solution for each other and whatever works for
Yeah, and
individuals.
and to just check that out at the end and say,
Mm-hmm.
"Was that helpful? What would
Mm.
have been more helpful?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so ask what people need, and then if that was helpful afterwards, so a bit of feedback after.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that's
because
so.
usually
Mhm.
what they'll say, because people are quite nice, is say, "Oh, yeah, yeah, that was great." And so you could follow
Yeah.
that up and say, "How could I have been more helpful?"
Mm. Mm,
What better support could I provide for you right now? Because that moves into the action. Is there something I can do?
right.
And actually, so I have this sister. I'm from a family of 9 people, and I have this sister, and at Thanksgiving in America, that's the big holiday in November,
Mm-hmm.
she would always cook the meal. And you'd go into the kitchen and, there'd be 9 of us waiting to eat. And you'd say, "What can I do?" Or, "Do you need any help? Do you need any help?" "Oh, no, 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 I've got it. I can do it. I can do it." So but what you need to do is you need to say, "How can I help?
Mm,
What can
mm-hmm.
I do?" So rather than saying, "Do you need any support?" Saying, "What can I do to support you right now?"
Mm,
And expect an answer.
right. Well, what if you feel like you can't give an honest answer? I guess that comes into trust territory
Yeah,
as
it
well.
does.
But
It does.
what if I don't feel safe talking about my true feelings or what I'm
Well,
thinking?
yeah, and that's a really good question because if the trust isn't there, you do need to be a bit guarded, because people have a way of shooting the messenger if they don't like what you have to say, and if there's no trust, that they can end up blaming you for the
Mm,
problem even.
mm-hmm.
And so I think you need to be a bit cautious and why are they asking you? If have you just met them? Have you had a conversation like this before? Have you disclosed in this way yourself? Because that's how trust is built is through that vulnerability. And if you haven't had a vulnerable point with them, I'd be a bit cautious because you're basically moving into a very intimate space in the
Right.
relationship that may not be warranted. So I wouldn't say don't try to be supportive, but I would say, be a bit guarded in what you offer because you might find this person living on your couch, and you don't even know them. So you do need to be a bit guarded. And so using that test around what other conversations have we had like this before? And
Mm-hmm.
if you haven't, just say, look, I'd love to get to know you a little bit better. And then, and to hear more about this, and maybe we could set up a time to talk more, but I wouldn't jump right into it if I didn't think I knew that person well and that we'd
Mm,
had a relationship based on trust already.
right. Right. And I wanted to talk about also, are there any differences in academic leadership versus corporate leadership?
Hmm. Yes. Yeah, I would say there are. And I say this because I've straddled both worlds,
Mm,
both as a supervisor of student projects, and of course having been a PhD candidate myself, and then having worked with leaders in industry for a number of years. And a lot of that comes back to that ask versus tell. So when we become an academic of degree, we're expected to tell people because we know stuff. And sometimes we have trouble pulling back on that. So I think our tendency to want to give advice is far greater than it might be in the corporate world where
mm,
so much is new that nobody knows it, particularly in this day and age where we've got, volatile, uncertainty, ambiguous, and all the other isms that are in the VUCA world. And I think that our leaders, not always, but have learned a bit more to be more humble in terms of assuming that they know because there are 100 ways up the mountain and one solution might work in one situation and not in another. But I do think in academia we do sort of suffer a little bit from believing our own press that we are the expert, so we must know. And then I think in some ways, some academics are embarrassed to say that they don't know.
mm,
To say,
mm-hmm.
well, you know what? I should know, but I don't, but I'll find out, so to be more on an even footing with their student.
Right. And that takes courage to tell people that you don't know something. I
It
mean, it's
does.
huge. It's huge.
It does. But what do you think the impact is when you do that? To say, I really don't know. That's a really good question. Let's look at that together. What would the impact be on the student, do you think, or on the graduate?
It's leading by example too. It's just
Exactly.
influence. I can
Exactly.
do that if you can do that. It's just reciprocal, and I love that.
Exactly. And that's what you're trying to just distill in their own leadership skills is that role modeling.
Amazing. Amazing. And I just want to have a final question. Thank you so much for your time. But one more question, which would be, if you could tell your younger self, PhD student Michelle, one piece of advice about leadership, what would that be?
Ooh, good question. See what you did there? You asked a really good question. Um, Let me just rephrase that. So something that I would tell my younger self about leadership.
hmm
Hmm.
One key piece of advice.
It's all about relationships. It's 100% about relationships. So delivery, getting that PhD across the board, getting it published, that's really important. But how you make people feel working with you, whether it be your supervisor, your fellow students, other faculty, that's where the leadership part comes in. And so, leadership is a contact sport, and you don't get there working in a room closet by yourself. You need to get out there, you need to share, you need to be open, you need to ask for feedback. So it's about relationships,
Mm, mm.
just
I
like
think,
the one we have.
yeah,
Yeah.
just
Look how far we've come in such a short time.
it's amazing. And I think it just speaks volumes about the type of person you are as a person too, because you're just so friendly and so giving and so generous all the time. I'm just amazed that you're spending hours with me talking about life and,
Yeah, but I'm talking
so
about something I love talking about. So, you're indulging me, really.
well, I thank you so much for your time today, Michelle. It's been so fantastic, and I'm sure a lot of people will get so much out of this conversation. That's
Yeah.
why we have this podcast. And where can people find you?
Yeah. So, hey, listen, I'd love to connect with any of your listeners on LinkedIn. And you can find me just by putting in my name, Michelle Shields. Yeah, I'd love to have more followers on LinkedIn. So that would be great. I try to write a thought provoking post at least once a week, something that makes you go, I never thought of it that way. So yeah, I'd love to meet up. And of course, like you said, I'm in my third life. So my third life is all about developing others, and particularly in the leadership space. So reach out to me. I'm always happy to have a coffee with people, talk about careers, talk about, fun stuff that they're interested in. Yeah, I'm happy to.
Amazing. And of course, Michelle also teaches at the University of Canterbury. So if you're there, you could take one of her leadership courses or
Absolutely.
anything like
Yeah.
that. You're also in the entrepreneurship space, startup space, and you also coach people in that space. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And I do a fair bit of teamwork as well. I'm doing in fact, a combination of entrepreneurship and team development at the moment, using dynamic teaming from Amy Edmondson, who's done her research in the medical sphere. So when you've got a team that is highly interdependent and your success depends on my success, there are some specific things that you need to do to build a dynamic team in that space. And that's an area of specialty that I'm moving into.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining in. And please do follow Michelle and this Unseen podcast on whatever social media platforms, LinkedIn. There's also YouTube, Spotify, and TikTok. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Bye.
Jessie.
Thank you, Michelle. Bye.